Every evening, just before night fell, the man carried out his careful routine. He sprayed alcohol across the door and frame, wiping away any trace of scent that might betray him. Inside, he cleaned his dog's paws and fur, speaking softly to calm them both. As the sky darkened, he fixed steel plates over the windows and locked every bolt, working with quiet urgency. The house was left in total darkness, yet he still felt exposed. With his rifle held tight to his chest, he slipped into the bath and drew his dog close, listening to the distant city settle into an uneasy silence. When night claimed the streets, the world no longer belonged to people. The infected drifted through alleys and across empty roads, guided by sound and smell. Years ago, a virus had torn civilization apart, leaving only ruins and scattered survivors. Those who remained lived by strict habits, counting the hours of light and fearing the return of darkness. The creatures feared the sun, but in the shadows they ruled, and every living soul learned to hide, wait, and endure. Will was one of the few who endured. He moved through the empty city by day, gathering supplies and scanning the streets for signs of life. The silence pressed on him, heavy and unbroken, and he filled it with routine, with tasks that gave shape to his hours. Yet each evening as the light faded, he returned to his shelter, sealing himself away from the night, knowing that beyond his walls, the darkness was alive with hunger. By morning, the city lay silent beneath a pale sky. Will stepped outside with measured care, scanning the streets before moving. The ruins of buildings stood like empty shells, their windows staring blindly over abandoned roads. He drove slowly at first, listening for any sound that did not belong to the wind. In the distance, a deer crossed the road and vanished between two broken shops. Hunger stirred, but he let it go, knowing that risk often outweighed reward. He returned to his underground lab and checked the cages where infected rats paced in restless circles. Most showed no change, their eyes still wild, their movements sharp with fear. One, however, shrank from his presence and curled into the corner, breathing in shallow bursts. The small shift gave him a fragile sense of hope. He recorded the result, adjusted the dosage, and prepared another injection, driven by the belief that even the smallest progress mattered. At midday, he spoke into the radio, his voice steady despite the emptiness that answered him. The habit had become a promise to himself that he would not fall silent, that he would keep reaching into the void. Later, he walked along the harbor, watching the water move against rusted hulls, and for a moment he allowed himself to imagine other survivors somewhere beyond the horizon, listening to the same waves, holding on to the same thin hope. The afternoon passed in uneasy quiet. Will practiced small routines to keep his mind steady, counting steps as he moved through empty corridors, and testing doors he already knew were locked. His dog followed close behind, nails tapping softly on the concrete floor. The simple sound reminded him that he was not entirely alone, and he spoke to the animal as though it could answer, sharing thoughts he had not voiced in years. The dog listened, head tilted, eyes alert to every movement beyond the walls. When the sun dipped lower, long shadows stretched across the streets, and the city seemed to hold its breath. Will prepared for the night with practiced care, checking bolts, counting rounds, and sealing every gap he could find. Outside, faint echoes drifted on the wind, sounds too distant to name. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the quiet dread that came with the fading light. As darkness gathered, he drew back into his shelter with his dog beside him, bracing himself for another night in a world that had forgotten how to sleep. The next morning, Will ventured deeper into the city, following routes he rarely used. Dust rose beneath his boots, and the echo of each step seemed too loud in the hollow streets. He paused often, listening for movement, watching the shadows shift along broken walls. At a deserted shop, he gathered tins from fallen shelves and packed them into his bag with steady hands. The quiet pressed in around him, heavy and constant, and he found himself speaking aloud, naming each item as he took it, as though sound alone could keep the silence at bay. Later, he climbed to the roof of a tall building and scanned the horizon through his scope. The skyline stood stripped of life, a forest of concrete and steel under a washed sky. For a moment he imagined smoke rising from a distant window, proof that someone else still breathed in this ruined place. The vision faded, leaving only empty air. With a slow breath he turned back towards home, aware that hope, like daylight, was something he could not afford to waste. Night crept across the city with slow intent, pooling in doorways and filling the spaces between ruined buildings. Will felt the change in the air before he saw it in the sky. The subtle drop in warmth that always came with fading light. He quickened his pace, guiding his dog along familiar paths, avoiding open streets where sound traveled too far. Each step carried urgency, yet he forced himself to remain calm, counting breaths to steady his nerves. Panic was as dangerous as any creature that hunted the dark. As they neared home, distant cries drifted from somewhere beyond the blocks, thin and wavering, like echoes of pain carried on the wind. Will stopped, heart hammering, and raised his rifle, scanning the empty road ahead. Nothing moved, yet the sense of being watched clung to him. He urged the dog forward, slipping through the door and sealing it behind them with shaking hands. The lock slid into place with familiar weight, a small barrier against a vast night. Inside he worked quickly, cleaning the dog's fur and paws, wiping away the grime of the streets. He spoke in low tones, more for himself than for the animal, recounting the small details of the day as though routine might keep fear at bay. When the final window was sealed and the last light extinguished, he settled into the bath with his rifle held close. Beyond the walls, the city stirred with unseen movement, and he waited, listening, until the darkness became a presence he could endure. Dawn arrived with a thin, gray light that slipped through the cracks of the boarded windows. Will stirred at the sound of his alarm and rose with stiff limbs, the weight of another night still heavy on his chest. He moved through the house, unbolting doors and easing panels aside, careful not to rush. The world outside seemed unchanged, yet he knew that safety was only temporary, a fragile gift of daylight that would soon fade. He led his dog into the yard and watched the animal circle, nose low to the ground, testing the air. No fresh scent lingered, and the quiet felt clean for once. Will took the chance to repair a loose panel, tightening screws and checking seals, turning maintenance into a shield against fear. Small tasks filled the hours, and he welcomed them, for they gave shape to time that might otherwise slip into endless waiting. Later, he drove through streets lined with silence, gathering what little he could carry. He passed faded signs and broken shop fronts, each one a reminder of lives that had once moved here with purpose. At the harbor, he stopped to watch light scatter across the water, allowing himself a brief moment of stillness before turning back towards the city. The day would pass, as all days did, and night would follow, but for now, he breathed in the calm and held on to it. The afternoon heat pressed down on the streets, drawing a faint shimmer from the cracked tarmac. Will kept to the shade where he could, moving along the edges of buildings and pausing often to listen. His dog stayed close, tail low, ears flicking at distant sounds that might have been nothing more than whine through broken glass. Together, they moved with the quiet rhythm of habit, each step placed with care. At a narrow crossing between two towers, Will froze. Fresh marks scarred the dust, thin lines that curved towards a darkened doorway. He knelt to study them, tracing the path with his eyes. The tracks were recent. His breath slowed as he weighed the choice before him. Curiosity could mean death, yet knowledge might mean survival. After a moment he marked the spot on his map and backed away, unwilling to follow the trail into shadow. As the sun drifted lower, he felt the familiar pull of urgency. The city seemed to tighten around him, as though the walls themselves were drawing closer. He guided his dog back towards home, keeping to routes he knew well, every sense alert to the smallest change. When at last he sealed the door behind them, the quiet inside felt earned. A fragile reward for another day survived. Night settled over the city like a heavy cloak, muting every distant echo and turning familiar streets into narrow corridors of shadow. Will checked each bolt and latch twice, listening to the faint scrape of metal as he secured the final panel across the window. The house breathed with him, a slow, hollow sound that matched the steady rise and fall of his chest. In the silence, even his own movements felt too loud. He moved through the rooms without switching on a single light, guided by memory and the faint glow of the moon leaking through thin cracks in the shutters. His dog followed at his heels, nails tapping softly on the floor. Will paused at the doorway of the lab, resting his hand against the frame. The low hum of the equipment was a small comfort, proof that some parts of the old world still obeyed him. He knelt beside the bench and checked the samples, adjusting a dial with careful fingers. Progress was slow, measured in tiny changes that might mean nothing, yet he clung to each small sign as though it were a promise. When he finally retreated to the bath, drawing the curtain closed around them both, he held his rifle close and waited for the dark to pass, counting the hours until the first hint of dawn. Morning crept into the city without warmth, a thin, colorless light spreading across empty streets and silent buildings. Will stepped outside with slow caution, scanning the rooftops and alleys as though the shadows might still be watching him. The air carried no sound of life, only the distant rustle of wind moving through broken signs and scattered leaves. Each breath felt heavy in his chest, as if the world itself were holding its breath with him. He walked down the steps and into the street, boots echoing faintly against the cracked pavement. The city stood frozen around him, a vast shell of stone and glass, stripped of its former noise. His dog stayed close, alert but calm, ears twitching at every small movement. Together, they moved through the stillness, two living shapes in a place that no longer remembered what life looked like. Will made his way towards the abandoned shop at the corner of the road. The windows dark and coated in dust. Inside, rows of shelves stood untouched, products long past their use. He gathered what little he could carry, moving with the quiet routine of someone who had repeated this task too many times to count. Each item he took felt like a reminder of the world that had been, a fragile link to a life that now existed only in memory. Before leaving, he paused at the doorway and looked back at the empty room. For a moment, the silence pressed in on him, thick and unkind. He turned away at last, tightening his grip on the bag at his side. Outside, the pale morning light stretched across the street, and Will walked on, knowing the quiet would follow him wherever he went. The sun climbed higher, but the warmth it once carried had long since faded from the city. Will drove slowly through the empty streets, the low hum of the engine echoing between tall buildings that no longer held voices or laughter. Dust rose behind the car, drifting through shafts of pale light that slipped between the towers of glass and steel. The road ahead stretched on, wide and vacant, as though the city itself had been abandoned in a single breath. He stopped near a crossing and stepped out, scanning the distance with careful eyes. The silence pressed against his ears, broken only by the soft click of metal as he checked his weapon. His dog remained in the passenger seat, watching him with steady focus, trusting his every move. That quiet trust weighed on Will more heavily than any threat beyond the streets. Moving along the pavement, he searched for signs of disturbance, any trace that the night had left behind more than darkness. Footprints, shattered glass, a smear of blood on stone. Each mark told a story he did not wish to read. The city offered no comfort, only reminders of how much had been lost. He gathered a few supplies from a deserted shop, then returned to the car without haste, knowing speed only led to mistakes. As he drove on, Will kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. Memories surfaced without warning, fragments of voices and faces that belonged to a world he could no longer reach. He pushed them aside, gripping the wheel more tightly. The engine carried him forward, and with it, the thin hope that another day might pass without disaster. By midday, the light had grown harsh, pouring down onto the empty avenues and bleaching color from every surface it touched. Will parked near a deserted square and climbed out, shielding his eyes as he studied the far corners of the space. The silence here felt deeper, as though the open ground swallowed sound before it could travel. Even the wind seemed reluctant to linger. He crossed the square at a steady pace, boots scuffing against the stone. In the center, a broken fountain stood dry and lifeless, its cracked bowl filled with dust and leaves. Will paused beside it, resting his hand on the cold edge. Once, water must have danced here, and people must have gathered in the shade to talk and laugh. Now the place held only echoes of what it had been. His dog circled the fountain, nose low, searching for traces of scent that no longer meant safety. Will watched him closely, alert to any sudden change in posture. The daylight offered protection, yet it never brought peace. Danger lingered in every shadow, waiting for the moment the sun would weaken. After searching the surrounding buildings, Will collected what he could find and marked the location on his map. The routine steadied him, giving shape to hours that might otherwise have slipped into nothing. When he finally turned back towards the car, the square lay silent once more, as if he had never been there at all. The city closed around him again, vast and indifferent, and Will carried on, knowing that night would come whether he was ready or not. The afternoon slipped by in a haze of pale light and drifting dust. Will returned to his car and drove towards the river, following roads that curved between silent buildings. The water lay still against the docks, its surface broken only by the slow movement of debris carried by the current. He stepped out and stood for a moment, letting the open space ease the tightness in his chest. The river reminded him that time had not stopped, even if the city felt frozen in it. He moved along the edge of the dock, scanning the dark gaps beneath the platforms. His dog stayed close, muscles tense, ready to react to any sudden sound. Will lowered a rope and checked the shadows below, then pulled it back with care, satisfied that nothing stirred. The routine brought a fragile sense of control, a feeling he clung to in a world that had stripped him of nearly everything else. At the far end of the dock, he paused to listen. The wind whispered across the water, carrying faint echoes that might once have been voices. Will closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, forcing himself back into the present. There was no room for longing here. He turned towards the car at last, knowing the daylight would soon begin to fade. Night would return, and with it the dangers he could never fully escape. The final stretch of road opened ahead of him, lined with buildings that stood like dark sentinels against the fading sky. Will drove with steady focus, eyes flicking from mirror to mirror, watching the long shadows stretch across the tarmac. The light was thinning quickly now, draining color from the world, and leaving behind only shape and movement. Each second felt heavier than the last. He parked near his house and remained in the car for a moment, listening. The city offered no warning, no hint of what might be waiting beyond the doors and windows. His dog shifted in the seat beside him, sensing the change in Will's breathing. Together, they stepped out into the cool air, moving with the quiet urgency of those who knew time was against them. Inside, Will sealed each entrance with practiced speed, steel panels sliding into place with dull, familiar thuds. He worked without pause, hands steady despite the pressure building in his chest. When the final bolt was secured, he stood in the darkened room, counting the seconds between his breaths. The house settled around him, locked tight against the night. He checked the corners, the corridors, the narrow spaces where shadow gathered. Only when he was certain the routine was complete did he allow himself to slow. Night pressed against the walls, patient and unyielding, and Will prepared to endure it once more. The night deepened, thick and heavy, pressing against the house as though it were a living thing. Will sat with his back against the cold tiles of the bathroom, his dog curled close beside him. The rifle rested across his knees, the weight of it grounding him in the present. Outside, faint sounds drifted through the walls, distant scrapes, soft thuds, the low murmur of movement that never quite became clear. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to breathe. Each breath was slow and measured, counted in his mind to keep panic at bay. The dark played tricks on him, shaping fear out of nothing, and he fought the urge to imagine what waited beyond the sealed doors. In the silence, memories slipped through the cracks. Voices long gone, laughter that no longer belonged to the world. His dog shifted, pressing closer, and Will rested a hand on its warm fur. The simple, living warmth reminded him that he was not entirely alone. Hours passed in fragments of sound and stillness. When at last the first pale hint of dawn crept into the room, he opened his eyes and let the light touch his face, knowing he had survived another night. The city drifted into a strange stillness as evening approached, the sky bruised with fading color. Will moved through the rooms with the quiet precision of habit, securing each bolt and fastening every panel. His hands knew the routine better than his mind did. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls, whispering through broken streets that once carried the noise of thousands of lives. Now there was only absence, thick and pressing. He checked the lab again, adjusting dials, marking the smallest changes in his notes. Each result felt like a fragile thread tying him to purpose. Without the work, the days would blur into empty hours, and the nights would stretch endlessly. His dog waited nearby, watching him with patient eyes that asked nothing and offered everything. Will rested his hand on its head for a moment, grounding himself in that simple presence. When darkness finally claimed the city, the familiar fear returned. It was not sudden. It crept in slowly, filling corners of the house and settling into his chest. He listened to the distant sounds beyond the walls, the low, restless movements that never fully revealed themselves. The world outside no longer belonged to him, and he knew it. All he could do was endure one night at a time. At dawn, he stepped into the streets again, the sun washing pale light over ruins that looked almost peaceful from a distance. He gathered what he could carry, moving with caution through open spaces and narrow corridors of debris. The silence followed him, vast and unbroken, until even his own breathing felt like an intrusion. Yet he pressed on, because stopping meant surrendering to the weight of it all. The days passed in this rhythm of motion and stillness, hope and exhaustion. Each night he survived felt like a small victory, though the cost of those victories was written in the lines of his face and the heaviness of his steps. Still, he continued, driven by the fragile belief that somewhere beyond the empty streets and darkened buildings, there might be a reason to keep going.